1966. Historical footage. In it, he is already 72 years old, and he calmly swims across the Yangtze River accompanied by Red Guards, young activists of the Cultural Revolution. For the founder of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong, this sporting event was risky considering the 1.5-kilometer width of the river, the strong current, and the deadly whirlpools.
However, Mao Zedong could not retreat, as this swim had a political character. It was meant to show the world the excellent physical condition of the Chinese leader, dispelling rumors that he was supposedly ready to retire. However, there was also another cunning political subtext here directly related to the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev.
According to documentary evidence, he won his first swim against Khrushchev in 1959. At that time, the Celestial Empire was celebrating the 10th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. After the demonstration, Mao Zedong invited the Soviet leader to his country residence in the Shishan Mountains. However, Khrushchev, upon arrival, was led not to the banquet table as expected, but to the pool where Mao was swimming. According to eyewitnesses, Nikita Sergeyevich, unprepared for such an event, went into the water in black satin shorts down to his knees. And then all those present will see that the leader of the great power does not know how to swim at all. Usually Khrushchev would wade in up to his waist and squat to submerge, while Mao would easily swim across kilometer-wide rivers. In the pool, he swiftly swam by, ignoring the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, who had lowered his chin into the water. In general, according to experts, Mao humiliated him, showing who was the boss. Khrushchev indeed looked awkward. He left the Chinese residence in indignation, without having a proper conversation with Mao Zedong. Thus began the open confrontation between the leaders of the two communist powers. In just 10 years, it will lead to large-scale bloodshed when multiple rocket launcher systems, GRAD, are used for the first time. The world narrowly avoided nuclear war then. What caused the breakdown of Soviet-Chinese friendship and the rift between Khrushchev and Mao? And who won in this deadly clash? Beijing, present day, Tiananmen Square, Mao's mausoleum. There is always a line here. Everyone wants to see the great leader. Mao is more alive than anyone today. The country lives by his precepts. His name is sacred. Moscow, Novodevichy Cemetery, Khrushchev's grave. Modest wilting flowers and silence. His main achievement, the debunking of Stalin's personality cult, for many today, even in Russia. The merit is debatable. By today's standards, Khrushchev is a rough, contradictory, and quarrelsome politician. But it wasn't always like that. 1954, the first meeting of Khrushchev and Mao. Look, the Chinese leader is applauding him. For him, Khrushchev is still the heir of the great Stalin, the leader of the largest power, for which China is the younger brother. It would seem that the USSR and the PRC are destined for an unbreakable friendship and 10,000 years of great happiness. However, this is not meant to happen.
What happened between the two leaders? Who struck first?
Footage of unique chronicles. The year 1957, just over 3 years of close cooperation. Everything seems fine with the leaders, but only at first glance. As soon as the reporters are led out of the meeting room, something incredible will happen. Mao Zedong will condemn the opportunism of the Soviet leader. He will tell Khrushchev that he is flirting with the West by pursuing a defeatist policy of peaceful coexistence. According to the official version, Mao did not approve of the denunciation denunciation of Stalin's cult of personality. However, declassified documents indicate that the problem was much deeper. Look, this is an unknown note from Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov, who was then head of the CPSU Central Committee's Department for Relations with Communist and Workers' Parties of Socialist Countries, secretly to Khrushchev. According to our data, from 1958 to 1960, the People's Republic of China will have to repay a debt to the Soviet Union in the amount of 2,300,000,000 rubles. This amount will exceed the annual volume of Chinese exports to the USSR by 4 times. A sensational document. It turns out that in addition to selfless Soviet aid, the Chinese had to pay for many things. Researchers believe that Khrushchev tried to keep Mao on a dead hook, and that the Communist Party of China was considered by the Soviet leader as a tool for conducting international policy. And Mao understood this well. If under Stalin, aid to China was limited to barter, mostly without the involvement of monetary funds, then Khrushchev, as soon as he came to power, would grant China a loan of 500 million gold rubles, brotherly, generously, wholeheartedly. But the money had to be repaid. This meant that cooperation with the USSR made China a financially dependent state.
Under Stalin, there were strict rules of the game. Under Khrushchev, these rules were abolished and a voluntarist policy began, depending only on his mood.
According to researchers, after Stalin's death, Mao no longer wished to remain in the role of a younger brother and acknowledged Khrushchev as the leader of the socialist camp. He felt constrained in his embrace, he wanted to break free and go his own way. It is known that on the day of the conflict that erupted behind closed Kremlin doors, Mao Zedong decided to cut short his visit and fly to Beijing. Here are these shots. Our government is seeing off the Chinese delegation. Behind the demonstrative farewell handshake of Khrushchev and Mao, their routine smiles, many government members might think that the conflict that arose did not go beyond work-related tensions. However, this was Mao's last trip abroad. The great helmsman realized that the Soviet Union was much more afraid of losing China than China was of losing the USSR. The perceptive and cunning politician had already found Khrushchev's weak spot to respond in his own way. Most of you are seeing this footage for the first time. 1954. This is how grandly the first visit to their country by the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, was covered in China at that time.
Strictly speaking, China, practically until the beginning of the 19th century, was a gigantic country, a country that gave rather than received, a country that produced, by various estimates, from 25 to 36% of the world's GDP. That is, it was simply a giant. Naturally, all Chinese goods went through Central Asia or through sea straits to Europe. And of course, China simply infused its goods, inventions, including, for example, silk and porcelain.
It only recently became announced that during Khrushchev's first visit, Mao Zedong asked him for help in creating nuclear weapons. The Korean War and the TaiwanStraitCrisis caused a serious conflict between China and the United States. That is why Mao sought military assistance from the Soviet delegation and persistently demanded an atomic bomb from Khrushchev.
China was the most developed country in the world until the 19th century, that's for sure. Except for one thing, it did not have a developed army. And when these foreigners came, they were able to crush all these technical and economic achievements within a decade. And China concluded that it is necessary to be able to protect what you have achieved.
However, judging by declassified documents, Khrushchev had entirely different plans. Not only did he not intend to arm China, he decided to reduce his own army. And along with this, he took an unprecedented step, which for some reason is still not openly discussed. The fact is that in 1952, at the initiative of Mao and with Stalin's consent, the lease of the Soviet formally joint naval base Port Arthur on the Hong Kong Peninsula in the northeastern part of China was extended indefinitely. And against such a cloudless historical backdrop, a sensational Khrushchev directive appears on behalf of the Presidium of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Since the year 1952, the situation in the Far East has changed. Military actions in Korea and Indochina have ceased. China's defense capability has strengthened. All the facilities restored and built by the Soviet Union in Port Arthur since 1945 will be transferred to the government of the People's Republic of China free of charge by April or May of 1955. This unknown document, which provides for the handover of an ice-free port, a valuable strategic asset, a stronghold of peace in Southeast Asia, will be classified as top secret, a special folder. Khrushchev will announce his unprecedented decision to Mao Zedong on the very first day of his visit to China, and will ceremoniously hand him a list of the transferred property and armaments. 11 pages of densely typed text amounting to tens of millions of gold rubles, not counting 4 gifted destroyers of Project 7 and 11 Soviet submarines of various classes.
Many believe that Khrushchev was simply a foolish person. But observing his policy, we understand that he was not erratic. He did everything purposefully. And from this arises one conclusion. Either he is a destroyer by nature or someone was behind him.
The agreement with China was pushed to be broken by Khrushchev due to this unknown document. Members of the Central Committee acquainted Nikita Sergeyevich with it 2 months before the Soviet delegation's trip to China. Secret, the expenses for financing the units of the Soviet army in China and the payment of ruble deposits to servicemen are provided in the amount of 284 million rubles. These expenses were covered by the remaining Chinese currency in the cash register of the State Bank of the USSR. Currently, the remaining Chinese currency is depleted. Minister of Finance of the USSR, Arseny Zverev. From this and other declassified documents, Khrushchev's logic becomes clear. So, by saving 284 million a year on military salaries, dismantling their own 39th Army in peacetime, and gifting the Chinese weapons and property worth 40 million gold rubles, Khrushchev, in exchange for his generosity, decided to implement a program to modernize the Soviet fleet, which included the creation of aircraft carrier groups. Khrushchev reasoned like this: Port Arthur isn't going anywhere. It's under the protection of Chinese allies, so the saved funds will be used for aircraft carriers. Khrushchev planned to build them in the Balkans, in socialist Albania. He even signed an agreement to establish a base in Vlora. At that time, the idea that the USSR might have tensions with China and Albania seemed laughable. However, the situation did not develop as he wished. Arriving in China on official than an official visit in October 1954, Khrushchev behaved like many of our compatriots do when they find themselves in another country. He had fun, drank, tried to kiss Mao, and jokingly asked to feed the Soviet delegation poisonous snakes so that, quote, life wouldn't seem like honey to them. According to researchers, for the Chinese mentality, such tactless behavior did not match the bright image of the leader of a great power.
They are all focused on the idea that a noble man, well, this is some ideal, whether a politician or a businessman or someone else. A noble man should not boast or ostentatiously display his successes. This is fundamentally important. A noble man should conduct himself modestly, but this applies not only to the individual, but to the entire state as well.
In the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., there is a transcribed record from the year 1954 in which Khrushchev addresses Mao during his visit. You know my point of view. I was against Stalin's senile foolishness during his lifetime. I emphasize senile foolishness. Judging by the transcript, Mao remains silent and then, as if he didn't hear Khrushchev's remark, demonstratively presents him and Defense Minister Bulganin with 12 volumes of Stalin's works, translated into Chinese in a special binding and with his own autographs. According to documentary evidence, the Soviet leaders returning to Moscow pretended to have forgotten them in their residence. Moreover, Khrushchev and Bulganin lived in different rooms but forgot the same thing: the gifted books. And it is clear that they did not forget but intentionally left them, showing disrespect to the host side. According to researchers, undoubtedly, the seeds of disappointment in the soul of the Chinese leader were sown by the Soviet leaders even then. Exclusive footage, his last interview. Sergei Leonidovich Tikvinsky, former consul in China. Tikvinsky saw with his own eyes how the Soviet-Chinese friendship was born, reached its peak, and how it was ineptly destroyed in a few years.
Impulsive Khrushchev, poorly educated, encountered someone no less impulsive but restrained in his impulsiveness, a philosophically minded person who inherited the very rich cultural traditions of China, where patting a partner on the shoulder or saying something crude was considered absolutely impossible. These personal qualities played their role.
And yet, it seemed from the outside that everything was excellent in the relations between our countries. In these shots, the Anshan metallurgical plant. It is being constructed under the guidance of Soviet specialists, and the equipment here is entirely Soviet. Alongside Chinese workers, there are workers and engineers from Moscow, cities of the Urals, and various Soviet republics. And this Boran, that time the largest metallurgical plant in Asia, was built in Wuhan. 250 Soviet masters and technicians were involved in it. And here it is, the first steel smelting. The Soviet Union transferred 156 practically ready enterprises with all the equipment to China and initiated that other countries of the socialist community also contribute to the prosperity of China.
Universal friendly support continued until 1956. However, the enthusiasm of the socialist countries sharply diminished after the 20th Congress of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, where Khrushchev denounced the cult of personality of Stalin. This will cause an incredible resonance in the world and a split within the socialist camp. According to historians, the year 1956 marks a new stage of anti-communist and anti-Soviet hysteria.
After the well-known leak of Khrushchev's secret report exposing the cult of personality around Stalin and its appearance in the pages of the New York Times, mass unrest began even in Soviet Georgia. Unrest and demonstrations spread to the People's Republic of Poland and Romania. A counter-revolutionary revolt occurred in Hungary. Moscow begins frantically searching for locations for new naval bases. Khrushchev will again turn towards the Far East, and by the spring of 1958, he will start sending Mao encrypted messages with proposals to restore Soviet-Chinese bases, begin building radar stations, and even create a joint naval nuclear fleet, with basing not only in Port Arthur, but extensively along the entire Pacific coast from Vladivostok to the Vietnamese border. Secret Soviet ambassador, Beijing. You should urgently meet with Mao Zedong, citing the assignment from the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union regarding the construction of military bases. Telegraph about the execution. Here are the documents with those ciphers, which, as it turns out today, only angered Mao. On July 22, 1958, he will summon Soviet Ambassador Pavel Yudin and, in the presence of the entire Chinese leadership, give him a humiliating dressing down. Mao characterized Khrushchev's initiatives as an attempt to turn the entire Chinese coastline into a Soviet colony. Here are a few of his remarks from the transcript. You never trusted the Chinese. To you, the Chinese are an inferior sort, fools and slobs. If you have a few atomic bombs, do you think you can control us through leasing? Neither the Soviet ambassador nor the Soviet leadership expected such a reaction from the Chinese leader. Khrushchev thought he was doing everything to please the Chinese leader. He even signed an agreement to develop uranium mines in Xinjiang, which will ultimately lead to the creation of a Chinese atomic bomb. He even gave up his own agents to make Mao believe in the sincerity of his goodwill towards him.
It was in the year 1956, Khrushchev, in order to appease Mao Zedong, who had some grievance against Khrushchev due to this speech at the party congress where the cult of personality of Stalin was denounced, decided to hand over to him the lists of Soviet Union agents working in China, after which all the agents were captured and eliminated.
Perhaps this page is the most classified in Soviet-Chinese relations. One thing is known. For the intelligence officers, this step by Khrushchev was unexpected, treacherous, and caused irreparable harm in the future. Moreover, Khrushchev, in his memoirs many years later, admits himself that Mao did not appreciate his gift, saying something like, "We want you to help us become a great power, equal to you in all respects, but you impose on us the role of a vassal. You even planted spies."
However, let's return to 1958, when Khrushchev was unsuccessfully trying to negotiate with Mao about building naval bases. According to documentary evidence, from the 31st of July to the 3rd of August, Nikita Sergeyevich and the new Minister of Defense, Rodion Malinovsky, who replaced Marshal Zhukov in this position, secretly visit Beijing. Mao Zedong demands that Khrushchev not interfere in internal conflicts related to Taiwan and disputed territories. He needs more effective support from the Soviet Union. According to Khrushchev's admission, it is only 3 weeks later that he realizes what was behind this request: a nuclear strike on the United States.
Few people know that by this time in the People's Republic of China, Soviet engineers had already built more than 700 fully equipped factories with all the infrastructure and equipment, 97 scientific and technological centers, and 11 testing grounds. By the year 1958, more than 120,000 Chinese students were trained for free in Soviet technical universities under military programs. 6,000 Soviet scientists and 85,000 various technical specialists, including in the field of atomic research, provided assistance to China during long-term assignments. Moreover, Khrushchev ordered the transfer to China of the technology for producing T-54 tanks, as well as Il-28 jet bombers classified in China as Hong. 5 and long-range twin-engine multipurpose Chu-16 Hong-6, including the missile-carrying variant and the tanker aircraft modification, which are still in service in China. In addition, Khrushchev transferred to China the technology for nuclear weapon carriers, the tactical Soviet missiles R-1, R-2, and the sea-based R-11F, with a full training cycle for Chinese specialists. Based on Soviet developments, the process of serial production of these Chinese missiles was launched in China. Dongfeng ente posteng dontuonto unsei, which means east wind. However, judging by declassified documents, it becomes clear that behind the arms supplies and slogans of Soviet-Chinese friendship, the Soviet-Chinese conflict was subtly maturing and deepening. The main motive was the serious disagreements between Moscow and Beijing on key issues of war and peace.
The first point is for the Chinese, both ordinary and not ordinary leaders, to restore historical justice through geopolitics. That is, to restore the greatness of the Chinese nation, the Chinese state, which in the Middle Ages and antiquity was the center of the world, through geopolitics. Zhonggu is precisely the Middle Kingdom, the Celestial Empire, the center of the world.
3 weeks after the secret meeting between Khrushchev and Mao in Beijing on the 23rd of August 1958, the People's Liberation Army of China will begin shelling 2 coastal islands, Jinmen and Mazu, in the Taiwan Strait, that were under the control of Taiwan. Here are these historical shots. The shelling became a continuation of the first crisis that flared up over the disputed islands in 1954 after the end of the Korean War. As documents show, Mao did not deem it necessary to inform the Soviet leadership about the timing and plans of the military operation, considering it an internal Chinese matter that did not concern the USSR. However, the shelling of the islands caused an acute international crisis, as the United States was the guarantor of Taiwan's security, and the Soviet Union was bound to China by alliance obligations under the Treaty of 1950. Eisenhower threatened China with an atomic bomb. Khrushchev reacted no less sharply. Look, this is a rather candid letter that Khrushchev will send to President Eisenhower on the 7th of September. The essence of it is that the use of tactical nuclear weapons by the Americans against China will trigger a retaliatory nuclear strike from the Soviet Union. And these are the recollections of Mao Zedong's personal doctor, Li Jizun. They reveal the sentiments of the Chinese leadership during the Taiwan crisis. According to Li Jizun, Mao was conducting a subtle, multi-directional strategy. On one hand, to break free from Khrushchev's intrusive oversight. On the other hand, he dreamed of obtaining the most advanced weaponry from him, including nuclear. And finally, the threat of a real war with the United States allowed Mao to mobilize the population for the Great Leap Forward. He stirred up the people with a simple slogan: "The enemy is at the gate." The Chinese began going to work in the fields, a hoe on one shoulder, a rifle on the other. Everywhere there were posters with slogans: "Tighten the belt, work more and eat less, divide 3 portions among 5.
In China, there is simply a torrent of passions, a flow of energy that, if not managed, will spill over and sweep away half of China. After all, when Mao Zedong, together with Jiang Qing and the Gang of Four, started this giant experiment of the Cultural Revolution, they captured this internal energy. They indeed released this energy. Half of China was destroyed, tens, hundreds of millions of victims. That is, in fact, Mao Zedong kind of unleashed this energy of millions of young people onto the streets.
Fire at the headquarters. Today, this energy has not gone anywhere.
This was also the case a few years before the Cultural Revolution, when Mao decided to enter communism before Khrushchev. For this, the Great Leap Forward took place. At that time, in every Chinese courtyard, they made steel and cast iron of poor quality. Despite the successes in mobilizing the population, the Great Leap Forward, initiated by Mao in the summer of 1958, faltered. The situation with food worsened. A mass famine broke out. Mao's position in the party leadership was shaken for the first time. In addition, an unforeseen international embarrassment occurred for the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. The spiritual leader of Tibet, the Dalai Lama, emigrated to India. In connection with this, Mao Zedong accused the Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, publicly calling him a double dealer, half man, half devil. Coincidence? But according to some historians, international tension once again came to the aid of the Chinese leader, preserving his authority. On August 25, 1959, the Chinese Indians spat over the Dalai Lama's escape escalated into armed clashes in Tibet. The armed conflict occurred a few days before Khrushchev's visit to the United States. At that moment, the Soviet leader felt on top of the world. His bluff, or not a bluff, about a retaliatory nuclear strike on the West worked. By the summer of 1959, the British government of Macmillan agreed to negotiations, and Eisenhower invited Khrushchev to come to the United States for an official visit. The last offer of this kind was made only to Stalin by Truman, and then, as if on purpose, China behind Khrushchev's back starts this conflict. According to historians, it was precisely because of Khrushchev's visit to the United States that the Soviet leadership decided for the first time to move away from unconditional support of its Chinese ally. It authorized us to call on the warring parties. find a peaceful way to resolve the conflict. In response to the TASE's statement on September 13, 1959, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China will send a closed letter to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, accusing the Soviet leadership of a policy of opportunism and concessions to the Indian, British, and American bourgeoisie.
Look, and these are already shots of Khrushchev's arrival in Beijing for the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China on October 1st.
The arrival of the Soviet leader in China took place immediately after his visit to the United States. Perhaps Khrushchev's trip to America added fuel to the fire. During the conversation with the Chinese leadership, Nikita Sergeyevich raised the issues of Taiwan and the Tibetan conflict without concern for diplomatic expressions.
Khrushchev, with all his innate directness, warned that China's manner of provoking and artificially maintaining international tensions does not suit not only the United States but also the Soviet Union.
For Mao, according to researchers, the main irritant was that Khrushchev, in an imperative manner, conveyed Eisenhower's request to release 5 Americans from detention. Many researchers believe that Khrushchev in Beijing did not show flexibility, tact, or wisdom, and his revolutionary diplomacy clashed with the same.
In a word, in Beijing, the unstoppable force met the immovable object.
This was the last meeting between Khrushchev and Mao. The Soviet leader flew home deeply hurt. He instructed Suslov to prepare a report with the harshest criticism of the Chinese Communist Party leadership and, above all, Mao Zedong. After this, the years of open confrontation begin when Soviet newspapers and magazines almost daily publish caricatures of the cult of personality in China. In conversations with leaders of fraternal countries, Khrushchev will openly insult Mao, calling him an old shoe. This unpleasant fact is even mentioned in the report of the Presidium of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, prepared with the aim of removing Khrushchev.
1964. On your screens, the tests of the Chinese atomic bomb. It turned out to be symbolic somehow. Precisely in the year Khrushchev was removed from power, China became the 4th nuclear power. There are various opinions about which moment in history became the countdown point for the collapse of the USSR. According to one of them, it was Khrushchev's Eastern policy. The split between our countries led to the Soviet Union being forced to withdraw enormous resources from its economy and invest them in strengthening the defense capability of the vast eastern land border, as well as spending on equipping and maintaining the troops in a state of full combat readiness.
With a strength of approximately 1.5 million military personnel.
All this led to increasing financial difficulties in our country. Mao Zedong, who became an icon for ordinary Chinese people during his lifetime, was not a humanist like Khrushchev tried to appear. Mao openly called himself a Stalinist and was not shy about repression. He led his people to victory in the class struggle with an iron grip, and until 1952, he publicly acknowledged the death of 700,000 of his compatriots. But he clearly explained to the Chinese that breaking the old regime could not be done without sacrifices. Mao was unwavering in his determination to renew China. He dreamed of doing this based on the Soviet model, which was founded on forced collectivization and the principle of state ownership, and the people believed him and followed him to the end.
It doesn't matter who is in power. The red, so to speak, leader Mao Zedong, or the ancient Chinese dictator, emperor Qin Shi Huang or Kangxi or another. They are all leaders. They are all emperors in quotes. It doesn't matter what position or what ideology Kotaki and his policy, his orders are sacred. They are holy. Well, holy to the souls of the Chinese. It is not phrased this way, but everyone understands that they cannot be left unfulfilled. And so this phenomenon of Chinese civilization is to connect the unconnectable.
The People's Republic of China, the year 2020, not just a wealthy state, a superpower. The stability of the world's economies depends on its economic well-being. 1,400,000,000 inhabitants. The largest country by population with enormous military potential.
The local population is certain. Without Mao Zedong, who led China through 70 years of liberation struggle, voluntary confinement, and famine, there would not have been subsequent reforms which the Chinese deeply believe are aimed at building a society of justice and prosperity.
I simplify, I can say that the reason for this economic miracle is that the Chinese civilization, in the person of communist leaders, primarily Deng Xiaoping, combined, well, roughly speaking, liberalism and socialism. Partially the liberal ideology, not all of it in the economic part, and completely preserve this Chinese version of Marxism. Precisely the Chinese version, not the European one adapted by Lenin and Stalin for Russia, but specifically the Chinese one, adapted by Mao Zedong and his followers.
Khrushchev, for some reason, dragged the USSR into endless competitions with the USA, instead of calmly focusing on developing the state and improving the quality of life. His Raya as an adventure, with overfulfilling the meat and milk plan extended to other regions, ruined the economy. His corn campaign led to a bread shortage. His Lysenkoism, promoting the ideas of a short-sighted agronomist, worsened the state of agriculture. Khrushchev created living conditions in which the party nomenclatura could break laws with impunity, act in their own selfish interests, and bear no responsibility for it. A perfect breeding ground for corruption. And his hypocritical campaign to blame all sins, including his own, on the late Stalin led to the severing of friendly relations between the USSR and many countries and suddenly cast doubt on the ideals of socialism.